We are standing in the central gallery of the National Museum of the American Indians exhibition titled Americans. This exhibit explores the nature of the American people's relationship with American Indians. And it's based on the premise that most American people think that they have nothing to do with American Indians and that American Indians have nothing to do with them. And we are arguing that the exact opposite is true. We're arguing that Americans and American Indians share a deeply entangled history, that this is the history that shaped the United States of the Americas, and that it has had a profound and lasting impact on Americans' national consciousness and their popular culture. So we're standing in the central gallery, which we call Indians Everywhere. And as you can see, this large gallery is covered from floor to ceiling with images of American Indians. These are images that the American people have made of American Indians, and this imagery is pervasive in Americans' lives. It is so pervasive, in fact, that we call it the white noise of American lives. Most American people aren't even conscious that everywhere you look in American life, you will find imagery of American Indians. And we are arguing that this imagery exists as evidence of the deeply entangled history that Americans and American Indians share. In exploring the history that lies behind this imagery, we explore three events in U.S. history: the story of Pocahontas, the Trail of Tears, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And today we're going to explore the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn was fought between the U.S. cavalry and an alliance of Lakota and Cheyenne and also Arapaho. This battle was a devastating defeat for the U.S. Army. It resulted in the death of General George Armstrong Custer, who was a Civil War hero, and in the death of almost 300 U.S. cavalrymen. This was the most shocking event in U.S. history of the late 19th century. But within a very short period after this event, within less than 10 years, Plains Indian warriors who were reviled by Americans become a symbol of the United States of America. So in this exhibition, we explore how it is that the Battle of Little Bighorn remained immensely important in the consciousness of Americans for over a century, and we explore exactly how it is that imagery of the Plains Indian warrior emerged as the stereotypical American Indian and also as a symbol of the United States. All of this is to say, we will be exploring how the image of the Plains Indian warrior was used to justify manifest destiny. So our gallery, which explores the Battle of the Little Bighorn, is divided into two halves. In one half, we look at Lakota concepts of warfare and what the Battle of Little Bighorn was about from their perspective. And on the other side of the gallery, we look at how it is that the Americans responded to the battle and how out of this battle emerged the image of the Plains Indian warrior. So essentially, there are three factors that led to the Battle of Little Bighorn, three immediate factors. One of them was the fact that at this time, the U.S. Army is rounding up American Indians and confining them to reservations. Famously, Sitting Bull and his followers are not agreeing to live on reservations. The other thing that's happening is that the Black Hills are being flooded by prospectors and miners because there's news that there's gold in the Black Hills. The third factor is that in 1874, President Grant sends in a military expedition led by General Custer. It's known as the 1874 Black Hills Expedition. He sends this military expedition into the Black Hills to confirm whether or not there's gold there. Now, the issue is that in the Fort Laramie Treaty, Lakota political sovereignty over the Black Hills was clearly acknowledged. Beyond that, the Black Hills are sacred to the Lakota people. And for the Lakota, as well as Cheyenne, the respect and preservation of the Black Hills is of paramount importance. So we're looking at how Lakota concepts of warfare relate to Lakota concepts of leadership, and how Lakota concepts of leadership fit in to a Lakota value system. And so, for example, for a man to distinguish himself as a leader in Lakota society, he not only had to exhibit bravery, but he also had to exemplify certain virtues. For example, wisdom, fortitude, generosity. And these values had to be acknowledged in him and be seen in him by others for him to be respected as a leader. So in our exploration into Lakota concepts of warfare, leadership, cultural values, we have on one side a blow-up of a unvarnished Lakota view of the battle. This mural, or this ledger drawing behind me, was created by a veteran of the battle called Red Horse, and it very clearly gets across the brutality of the battle. On the other side of the gallery, we have a muslin which was painted by another veteran of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Strike the Kettle. And in the muslin painting, Strike the Kettle portrays a way of life before the reservation period, and a way of life that celebrates Lakota virtues and ways of living in the world. Next, we're going to go look at that muslin painting. This painting was made by a man named Strike the Kettle. Strike the Kettle was a friend of Sitting Bull. After the Battle of Little Bighorn, he fled up into Canada with Sitting Bull, stayed in Canada with Sitting Bull for 4 years. At the time, this was a major international incident. The United States wanted Sitting Bull back in the United States on a reservation. Eventually, Sitting Bull and Strike the Kettle returned to the United States. Sitting Bull was killed by Lakota tribal police. When he was killed, Strike the Kettle was with him. Sitting Bull was surrounded by his friends who were trying to protect him. Strike the Kettle was wounded in this incident. He went on to paint this muslin, which is very unique. For one thing, it's unique because of its size. It's 22 feet long. But the other thing is, it does not represent one single event, which is usually what these paintings do. And the museum brought out a life-size photograph of this muslin to the Pine Ridge Reservation to work with elders to try to understand what's going on in this painting. And what they say they think is going on is that a series of preparations leading up to a ceremony or an event is probably taking place. And they point out that on the muslin are pairs of pipes, and the pipe bowls and the stems are close together, signifying that a ceremony is about to take place. They point out that there are 2 pairs of wands, and these are used in the hunka ceremony, which very loosely translated is a making relations ceremony. It's a ceremony in which an individual will adopt a non-kin member of the tribe, and in doing so establishes kin relationships with that person. And what the Lakota people pointed out is that actually many women are depicted on this muslin, so they're saying that perhaps women are being honored. And they're saying that the event that might be taking place is either a hunka ceremony or a woman's coming of age ceremony. And they say this because both of these events end in what's known as a giveaway. And they interpret this scene in the upper right-hand corner as a giveaway. So on one side are 4 teepees with a woman standing in front of each teepee. On the other side are two distinctively painted teepees, also with a woman standing in front of them. And in the center are horses that are loaded down with trappings. And they're saying these are going to be gifts that are given away to tribal members. They also suggest that all of the symbols underneath the horses represent headdresses, and that these headdresses will be given to very prominent members of the community. And so what Lakota people say are going on here is not only that Strike the Kettle was painting a Lakota way of life as it existed before the reservation period, but that he's also representing everything that is important to the Lakota. He's representing Lakota spirituality, he's representing the importance of kin relationships, he's representing the importance of generosity as a cultural value. Strike the Kettle was a veteran of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and he knew that the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as were all other battles in the late 19th century in between the Lakota and the U.S. Army, they were fought from the Lakota perspective because their entire way of life was under assault. Once they were to be confined to reservations, the United States government was determined to prohibit their religious ceremonies. They were determined to force Lakotas to stop living their traditional way of lives, to become farmers, to adopt Christianity, to send their children to schools, which meant to forbid them from speaking their own languages. So what Strike the Kettle has depicted here is everything that was under assault and everything that was of intense importance to the Lakota people. This eagle feather headdress is placed right in the center of our gallery, and we worked with a Lakota elder, Dwayne Hollowhorn Bear, to interpret the headdress for us. Dwayne Hollowhorn Bear is a direct descendant of a veteran of the battle, and Dwayne Hollowhorn Bear is also an educator. And as he explained to us, eagle feather headdresses, which have become a iconic American image, eagle feather headdresses were actually only worn by very few Lakota men. And they were worn by men who once again had to exhibit certain Lakota virtues, the virtues being bravery, fortitude, wisdom, generosity. And as Dwayne Hollowhorn Bear explained, when a man wore an eagle feather headdress, he would only have the best interests of his society in mind when he was wearing it. Each eagle feather that is on the headdress was gifted to the man, and it was gifted to him to acknowledge some deed that he performed. And as Dwayne Hollowhorn Bear explains it, that deed could be as, quote, small as sharing one's food with somebody, or as large as saving somebody's life during battle. But the point is, each eagle feather represents a moment when that particular individual was honored by his community. And so for a man to have a eagle feather headdress with a trail that is this long obviously means that he was somebody who was revered and respected within his own society by his own people. While eagle feather headdresses are very closely associated with Plains Indian warriors, and Lakota warriors in particular, they're not the only style of headdress that Lakota men wore. There were various styles of headdress. And so while this style of headdress would have been worn by some individuals in the battle, and we know this from Lakota's own depictions of the battle, for example, Red Horse's depiction of the battle, we do know that there were Lakota men who did wear the eagle feather headdress in the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was by no means worn by a great number of men. So the other objects in the exhibit are also objects that are associated with men. They're men's war shirts and also shields. The shirts are showing the pride that leaders had in themselves. They are exquisitely decorated with porcupine quill work, with fringe, with horsehair ornaments. And in displaying the shields, we're explaining that the imagery on the shields represents the spiritual beings who protect warriors during battle, individual warriors during battle, and provide them with power. And we're making the point that in the Lakota belief system, a spiritual being will only come and help the warrior if that warrior is deemed worthy. So you're getting the idea that in Lakota society, an individual always has to be able to demonstrate and prove their worthiness. The two sections of our gallery are divided by a curtain which is covered with imagery of newspaper coverage of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We're very interested in the fact that the news spread rapidly, and it spread rapidly throughout the entire country, and it spread rapidly throughout the entire country as Americans were celebrating the centennial of the United States. So this devastating news came just as Americans throughout the country were sharing in jubilation. So three things made the spread of the news possible. It was the telegraph, the fact that there were, for the first time in the history of the country when a major event occurred, newspapers virtually in every territory, in every county, in every city, in every town. And it is also at this time that newspapers have just started using headlines, and of course, sensational headlines. So all Americans are caught up at the same time in the news of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and news of this devastating defeat is seared into national consciousness, literally within just a few short weeks after the battle occurs. So during the 1870s, this is the period when the United States Army is trying to confine American Indians throughout the country onto reservations. It's a period when there's still ongoing battles and skirmishes, but it's also a period when the country is feeling very confident that its westward expansionism is virtually achieved and the country is going to be moving forward. So the Battle of the Little Bighorn was not by any means the first defeat, utter defeat of U.S. cavalry officers, but it was the first time that there was such a huge defeat that could be telegraphed literally throughout the country, and that all Americans would understand what had happened from an American perspective at the same time. So the American people want to know the names of the officers who died. They want to know their biographies. They want to know the names of the enlisted men. Then they want to know exactly how the battle occurred. They want to see a map of where it occurred. They want to know where the soldiers were, where the Indians were. Then they want to know if any blunders occurred. But at no time does there ever seem to be any interest in understanding the battle from the Lakota perspective, or how this battle impacted the Lakota. As far as Americans were concerned, Lakotas were impeding westward expansionism, and that's as far as their examination into the event from a Lakota perspective was going to go. So in this section of the exhibit, we're looking at how a national shock, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, became a national myth, the winning of the frontier or the settling of the West. And so we're looking at how both the news of the battle and the imagery of the Plains Indian warrior literally rode a wave of technology from 1876 into the 20th century. So we begin with the telegraph and the spread of the news of the battle via telegraph and newspaper offices. And then we look at the Wild West show. Now, the Wild West show phenomenon took off in 1883. This is only 7 years after the battle, and it's with the Wild West show that you really start getting the romanticization of westward expansionism. Now, the Wild West shows coincided with the commercialization of entertainment in the United States. In other words, with the emergence of an entertainment industry, meaning that the Wild West shows had professional promoters who were in touch with theater managers throughout the country so they could have their Wild West shows shown throughout the country. And in order to do this, they also had to have investors, backers, who would help provide funds up front so they could travel their shows and, importantly, so they could advertise them. So these Wild West shows really were an investment opportunity for the entrepreneurs like Buffalo Bill and Pawnee Bill and for their backers. Now, the thing about the Wild West shows is that they were these equestrian extravaganzas that very often included reenactments of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And quite often, these reenactments were the finale of the battle. So Wild West shows were advertised through huge color posters that were created through the latest printing technology. It's called chromolithography. And these posters combined many bold colors along with words, and they were arguably the most advanced form of mass communication in the late 19th century. Invariably, Wild West posters depicted Plains Indian warriors astride a horse, wearing buckskin and an eagle feather headdress, intent on murdering pioneers and cavalrymen. So just as the newspapers seared news of the battle into the consciousness of Americans, the Wild West shows and the posters in particular seared the image of the Plains Indian warrior into American national consciousness and into popular culture. Now, the real significance of the Wild West shows is that with them, they are shaping American sense of history. Because in these shows, which are now, even though just 7 years after the battle, they're reenacting the battle, at this point, these shows and these reenactments become rousing fun for Americans. But the Plains Indian warriors are being presented as valiant, formidable foes. In other words, they are being presented as a foil to justify manifest destiny, the westward expansionism of American settlers, which, from an American point of view, necessitated confining American Indians and subjugating American Indians. While the Wild West shows are still ongoing, the image of the Plains Indian warrior moves into the 20th century with the latest technological advancement and form of mass entertainment, that is, motion pictures. And the Battle of the Little Bighorn is portrayed in silent films, then in talkies, all throughout the heyday of Hollywood, the 1940s and 30s, Technicolor period of the 50s, and well into the counterculture films. And with, for example, the silent films, in 1925, there is a film that's considered one of the great epics of the silent era. And in this movie, it's made clear in the written dialogue that Plains Indian warriors and Lakotas in particular were impeding the, quote, advancement of white men and Western frontier. And so this storyline of American Indians standing in the way of progress continues to be told throughout, as I say, the golden age of Hollywood, the films of the 50s, and even in the counterculture films. The counterculture films obviously begin to reflect a little bit more so than ever before on what was actually going on in the West in the late 1800s. But the thing about the films is that, of course, Native people are still being portrayed frozen in time, and that's a problem. There are no other people in the world that really others insist on locking them into a certain time period. So with the Battle of the Little Bighorn, with the Wild West shows, and then with the motion picture industry, you are getting images of, or an image of the Plains Indian warrior that is stereotypical and that is always frozen in time. And with it all, American Indians, Plains Indian warriors, are being presented always as formidable foes. And this is carried on and used by high schools and colleges across the country with their sports mascots, and it's carried on in the U.S. military, who names helicopters and weapons after American Indian tribes. So on the one hand, people might think that they're being honorific. The point is, and the aim of the show, is to get across that there is a history that lies behind this imagery, and that this imagery was created and it was perpetuated as a foil to justify manifest destiny and to justify confining Indians to reservations and to subjugating them. We've titled this section, "Who Really Won the Battle of Little Bighorn? It's Complicated." And the reason why we say this is there seems to be a back and forth. It seems that, well, the Lakota won the battle, but then they're confined to reservations, but then they emerge as almost as celebrities and as a symbol of America. And so who did win the battle? And for us, where this rests is with the fact that the Lakota continue to fight to this day for the restoration of the Black Hills. After the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1877, the United States unilaterally took control of the Black Hills that were acknowledged as sovereign Lakota territory in the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Ever since that happened, ever since 1877, Lakota have been trying, they have been fighting to get control of the Black Hills. Their fight for the Black Hills made it to the Supreme Court, and in 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled that yes, the United States of America did illegally seize the Black Hills. However, they did not order the United States to return the land to the Lakota. They ordered for the Lakota to be financially compensated. To this day, the Lakota have not accepted this money because the Black Hills remain important to their religious beliefs, their religious ceremonies. And so we title this section, "Who Won? It's Complicated," because this is an ongoing history that has yet to be played out.